What is up, everyone? Roy here, and you were listening to the Clemenz with a Z podcast. Now, today I'm diving deep into a subject that has raised eyebrows and sparked conversations for decades: the relationship between churches and money. From the production value of Sunday services to the tax exempt status that many churches enjoy, I'm peeling back the layers to explore how finances shape the modern church experience. Now, over the past year, as y'all know, I've been visiting a variety of churches, not in search of a home, but as a part of a personal research project. I've been curious about how evangelical churches operate, questioning their practices and culture. Through this exploration, I've hoped to gain a better understanding of my own upbringing and grapple with a larger question: are all churches a cult? But what I've seen has left me with a lot to think about. Most of the churches that I'm seeing are wild. The sheer size of these buildings can be overwhelming. An enormous state of the art facility, complete with professional grade lighting, sound systems, and even concert style screens that felt more like a performance venue than a place of worship. And then all these churches I see, merch stands, coffee shops. It just leaves me with lots of questions. Now, one of the key issues I'll tackle today is the tax exempt status of churches. It's a privilege that has allowed religious organizations to amass significant wealth over the years. But is it being used responsibly? Are these funds truly going toward community building and charitable works, or are they being funneled into creating megachurch empires? And what about the ethics of asking congregants, some of whom may be struggling financially, to give beyond their means? I'll also discuss the psychological and emotional impact of money in the church setting. How do tithes and offerings affect members' relationships with their faith? Does the pressure to give tithe foster generosity, or does it lead to guilt and manipulation? And then finally, I'll share some personal reflections on how this topic ties back to my own experiences with the ICOC. As someone who's seen the inner workings of a church that many consider a cult, I can't help but draw parallels and question how widespread these practices really are. Now, this episode isn't about pointing fingers, condemning anyone's faith, condemning people for giving church to the church. It's about asking questions, seeking clarity, and encouraging transparency. So whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, this conversation, I think, is for you. So I want to start with a question: why are churches exempt from taxes? For many, maybe for you all listening, this might seem like a strange privilege in the world where every business and every individual contributes to public infrastructure and services through taxes. And so I want to dive into the layers of the issue using churches in Virginia Beach as a focal point, only because this is the city that I live in and for no other reason than that. And this isn't just about tax law, it's about accountability, transparency, and the social impact of such exemptions. So, churches in the United States are exempt from paying federal income tax under the Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. Now, this exemption is based on the principle that religious organizations serve the public good, much like charities and other nonprofits, and therefore qualify for tax exempt status. Now, additionally, most churches don't even have to file detailed financial disclosures, such as an IRS Form 990, which would provide a clear picture of its revenue or expenditures. Now, this makes it difficult to determine exactly how much revenue churches generate annually. And don't worry, please don't let me lose you on all these forms and documents and all of that. It's only going to be for a little bit longer. I just wanted to provide a clear picture of what I'm working with. All right. And so, key reasons why churches don't pay taxes besides that: there's the separation of church and state. The First Amendment, the U.S. Constitution, it established the separation of church and state. Taxing churches would be seen as government interference in religion or a way to exert control, which could violate this principle. There's a public benefit aspect. Churches are considered to provide social and spiritual services that benefit communities, such as charitable work, counseling, and community support. Now, tax exemption is a way or seem as a way to encourage these contributions. There's also the nonprofit status. Churches are classified as nonprofit organizations under U.S. tax law. Like other nonprofits, they are exempt from income taxes if they meet the criteria of operating for religious, charitable, or educational purposes. There's also a historical precedent. The tradition of exempting churches from taxation dates back centuries, even before the founding of the U.S. I'm pretty sure it's specifically around the time of the Great Depression when this method of taxes exemption was founded. And it just reflects a long-standing view that taxing religious institutions would be inappropriate. Now, in a lot of ways, I agree with that. I do. You know, we can't expect the government to do everything for us. And we have this sense of churches as a place of sanctuary. So I agree with a lot of it. But what's wild to me, it's beyond not paying taxes. Is that they don't even have to disclose their financial information at all. And this is something that everyone has to do. For-profit businesses, publicly traded companies are required by law to disclose detailed financial information. This could include their annual reports, profit loss statements, executive compensation. It's regulated by entities such as the SEC, Security and Exchange Commissions. There's private companies, privately owned businesses don't have to disclose financial information publicly, but they must file taxes and share relevant financial data with the IRS and other regulatory bodies. Organizations with 501c3 tax exempt status still must file Form 990 with the IRS annually. This includes information about their income, expenses, salaries of key employees, and how they use their funds. And this form is public and it just helps to ensure transparency. And then churches are an exception. They have the tax exempt status, but they still are not required to file Form 990 or publicly disclose their finances. This lack of mandatory reporting, it just makes it unique compared to other nonprofits. And so, what the key takeaway here for me is that churches benefit from a level of financial privacy that other nonprofits profits and businesses do not have to. It raises questions for me about transparency, accountability, and potential for misuse for funds, especially for these large, well-funded organizations. And I'm focusing on property tax specifically because property tax revenue is crucial for funding public services and infrastructure. It took me back to that feeling that, you know, churches are supposed to serve the public good, right? And property tax is a way to not even honestly have to think about it. You can provide revenue that can fund your community that the church is in. And property tax goes to education, public works, planning, utilities, public safety, things like police, firefighters, schools, all that stuff. And just to do a little deep dive and be a little bit more clear, I looked into our city's property tax revenue, and it said that there was a taxable assessment of approximately $82 billion, which meant that the current, how they rate the property tax, I'm not going to give everything to you guys because I don't want to get too in the weeds about this. Based on that, there would be $8.2 million in revenue, and that comes from houses, businesses, all of that. That's a lot of money that can help our community at large, right? So I decided to look at one specific church here in the city. And I visited it multiple times, been to conferences, and I chose this particularly because this church occupies a massive property here in the city and has other campuses throughout the city and the state. So the two campuses here in Virginia Beach are as follows. Property number one is 31 acres of land. Property number two has an additional 13 acres, which is a total of 44 acres of land owned by this church. And so I wanted to see how much revenue would be gained from this property and property taxes. So If a regular business or individual here owned 44 acres of land, there would be an estimated acreage value of $300,000 per acre. It's a total property value of 13.2 million. Now I went in and I looked at the Virginia Beach property tax rate, and it's basically 99 cents per $100 of assessed value. And the annual property tax would amount to $130,000. Now, that's a good bit of money that can go directly to the community at large. In these businesses, if it owned the land, they'd pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in property taxes, funding schools, roads, and other community services. But as a tax-exempt organization, this church contributes nothing to the public funds, as much as I've researched, but also because they don't have to file forms that are public. We don't know, right? This church could be doing it, but we don't know. So instead, all of it remains internal, and it seems like a privilege that is often justified by the claim that churches provide immeasurable social benefits. But does this exemption hold up to the scrutiny? It seems to me that all of the money that they raise just goes back to the church and not to the community. So is it providing social benefits? And for me, property taxes seem to be the most direct way an organization can support its local community. These taxes fund essential services, things that benefit everyone, including the members of the church. When churches are exempt from paying property taxes or taxes in general, it raises the question of whether they are truly contributing to the broader community or just simply serving themselves and their own members. Everyone has to pay property taxes, from homeowners to businesses, even down to the equipment my wife uses in her chiropractic office. She has to pay property taxes on the tables every year, the tables that she uses. Now, without contributing in this way, it feels like churches are prioritizing their internal needs over the community that surrounds and supports them. Shouldn't organizations that claim to serve the public good also contribute to the systems that enable that community to thrive? So the question I have is, if churches don't have to pay property taxes, are they really serving the community? And so I wanted to look at this biblically. There's three scripture or instances in the Bible where Jesus talks about taxes. Matthew 22:15 to 22, Mark 12, verses 13 to 17, and Luke 20:20 to 26. Now, in the Matthew verse, it's the Pharisees attempting to trap Jesus whether it's lawful to pay taxes to Caesar. Jesus asks for a coin, points to Caesar's image on it, and he has his famous statement, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar, and God what is God's." And so if Jesus himself recognized the legitimacy of paying taxes to earthly authorities, why should modern churches, especially those that generate significant revenue, be exempt from doing the same? The principle of fairness and contributing to the broader society would seem to align with both Jesus' teachings and the ethical responsibilities of faith communities. And his perspective on taxes challenges us to consider fairness and accountability, even when it comes to religious institutions. But this isn't just about taxes. It's also about how churches approach the idea of giving. While taxes fund public services, tithing, that word, ooh, it's a big word right now, isn't it? Tithing is often framed as a deeply spiritual act. It's a way to honor God and to support the church's mission. Yet, the message of tithing has always been complicated for me. It's been framed as a duty, something that you must do if you're serious about your faith. Pastors stand at the pulpit and tell us that giving to the church is giving to God. So many pastors present tithing as a direct transaction with God. But when you look at where the money goes, or how you can't look at where the money goes, salaries, building maintenance, multimedia production, and so on, doesn't necessarily align with this claim. That just might be me. I don't know. You hear this word, it's about the act of giving. The emphasis of the spiritual act rather than the actual financial exchange, to me, can feel manipulative, especially if it suggests that the more you give, the more you prove your faith or devotion. That's a big one. I heard it a lot. I heard it in my church. I also hear it in other churches that I have visited. There's that promise of blessing, right? It's that claim that tithing will lead to God's blessings. And it seems to create a transactional view of faith. It puts undue pressure on members, especially those struggling financially, who may feel compelled to give out of fear of missing out on divine favor. And look, I understand and I believe that if you're going to use something like a church, you're going to visit it, it's going to have childcare, you're going to be a part of it in a community. I do agree with giving because that's how churches make are are there. It's through donations. But what I see is that pastors use guilt to enforce tithing, implying that not giving demonstrates a lack of faith or commitment to God. And then you have the social pressure. In large congregations, there's public appeals for donations, like passing the collection plate or showing charts of giving levels. It can create an atmosphere where people feel judged if they don't give. But nowadays, it's that question of transparency, which the last 15 minutes have been about. Where does the money go? If the money is truly for God, how do we justify lavish church buildings, pastor's salary, housing expenses, or any other of those expenses? Should the money serve the community more effectively in tangible ways, like funding outreach programs or helping the poor? And there's no accountability. If there's no transparency, there's no accountability. They're not required to file financial disclosures, so members have really no way of knowing how their contributions are being spent. And some people just don't think about it. For me, it just, if I don't know where it's going, it makes it hard for me to give. Then there's the challenging theology. You know, what did Jesus say about giving? In the Bible, giving is often tied to helping the poor and the marginalized. So is the modern church use of tithes consistent with these teachings? Should faith be a transactional relationship where you give money in exchange for a blessing? Or is it something deeper, less material? You know? And so for you all, I wonder, have you felt pressure to tithe? How did it make you feel? Do you believe that tithing demonstrates faith, or should acts of faith extend beyond monetary giving? What do you think about how churches use their financial resources? And so I wanted to do a little bit of context of tithing in the Bible. In the Old Testament, the tithing originates in the Old Testament, where Israelites gave a tenth of their harvest or livestock to support the temple and the Levites. I found that in Leviticus 27:30 and Numbers 18:21. It was part of a broader system of offerings tied to the agrarian society that it was. And then the New Testament, it shifted. Tithing was not emphasized as a requirement. Instead, giving is portrayed as voluntary, cheerful, based on ability. 2 Corinthians 9:7, Acts 2:44 to 45. And you can see that Jesus critiqued leaders who focused on tithing while neglecting justice and mercy. And that's in Matthew 23:23. And so, personally, this message of tithing has always been complicated for me, framed as duty, something you must do if you're serious about your faith. Pastors stand in the pulpit and tell us that giving to the church is giving to God. They say it's biblical. God blesses those who give, and the more we give, the more blessings we'll receive. I've sat through services where this idea was hammered home relentlessly. At a recent church conference I attended here in the city, I couldn't help but notice how many times the offering bucket was passed. Each time a different pastor would step up, speak about the importance of giving, and pray fervently for the congregation to dig deeper into their wallets. It felt like an act of less like an act of worship and more like a calculated push to extract as much money as possible. And then I saw something on Instagram that took this to a whole nother level for me. The preacher was up on stage talking about how giving to the poor and needy isn't as important as giving to the church. He was so passionate, almost desperate, as he tried to convince people that even God views these acts differently. He implied that giving to the poor somehow carries less power or significance than giving to the church. And to me, this is bonkers. And how do people not see through this? I don't understand. Jesus himself said, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Matthew 25:40. He constantly cared for the marginalized, the poor, the sick, the forgotten. If anything, his ministry emphasized compassion and generosity toward those in need, not prioritizing institutions or leaders. Some churches have even gone so far as to create levels of recognition based on how much members give. It's unsettling to me on so many levels. If we're all equal in the eyes of God, why does giving more suddenly elevate someone in the eyes of the church? Is this really about faith, or is it a subtle way to manipulate people into giving more? I think it's the latter. I can't help but think about what the Bible actually says. In the Old Testament, tithing was a way for Israelites to support the temple and those who served in it. It was a part of their culture, tied to their agricultural livelihood. And like you saw in the New Testament, shifted its focus. Paul talks about giving as an act of the heart, cheerful, all of that. And Jesus called out religious leaders. So where does that leave us today? Some pastors preach that giving more will lead to more blessings, financially, spiritually, in every aspect of life. But that message feels off to me. Nowhere in the scripture does God promise us wealth or prosperity in exchange for donations. Faith is not a transaction. And I keep coming back to that question of transparency. And I know I've said it a lot, but if a church is asking me to give, shouldn't I know how the money is being used? Is it supporting the community, helping the poor, funding meaningful ministry? Or is it just lining the pockets of these leaders or building lavish facilities? Without clear answers, how can we be sure we're truly giving to God and not just feeding an institution? And it's hard for me learning all this not to feel cynical and disillusioned. If I want to give out of a place of gratitude and love, not guilt or pressure. But when I see these churches using tactics like public prayers, repeated appeals, or recognition levels based on giving, it feels less like worship and again, more like a business strategy. And when pastors say that giving to the poor is more important than helping the poor, I can't help but wonder, what Bible are they actually reading? Because the Jesus I know prioritized the least of these, and not the institutions claiming to represent them. And so recently I attended a Wednesday evening church service here, and the pastor was up there sharing about what he called an example of extreme faithfulness. He spoke about a man that he knew, I think it was in the past, way back in the day, who was incredibly poor. This man's car had tires so worn out, they were barely usable. He didn't even have enough money for light bulbs in his house, so he would carry a single light bulb with him from room to room. Each time he entered a new room, he would screw in the light bulb, and when he left, he would unscrew it and take it with him. Despite his circumstances, this man always gave to the church. The pastor praised his faithfulness. And he praised it in a way with tears in his eyes, like God was looking down at this man and saying, this man, he was so proud of this man for what he was doing. But all I could think of while he was sharing this story was, would a loving God require this much from a man like this? For me, I would think that if he's in a situation like this, the giving, his giving might need to be over for a little bit and he just needs to receive. And it brought up personal issues for me because I felt like I lived it. So growing up in the ICOC, tithing was more than an expectation, it was a mandate. The rule was clear: 10% of your income. Now, depending on who you talk to, it was either 10% of your gross or 10% of your net. And that income belonged to God. No exceptions, no excuses. It didn't matter if you were struggling to make ends meet or facing financial hardships. And on top of that, we would have an annual special missions contribution, which would require an additional 20%. That meant some families were giving away nearly a third of their income to the church. This burden has got to have been enormous. And it felt enormous for us, my family. And it was particularly challenging. My dad was a teacher. My mom, for most of my life, was a stay-at-home mom. And from what I saw and what I remembered, it looked like we lived paycheck to paycheck, scraping by most months. Yet my parents never missed a tithe. So, one instance of my life I want to share with you. It was before one of these special missions contributions, and I remember it vividly. And it still hurts my heart to talk about it. So my dad, he called us into the dining room. And we all sat down and he laid out about $5,000 in cash on the table. Now, to a kid in high school, that's an enormous amount of money. He let us hold it, he let us touch it, he let us look at it. And then he asked us, "What would you do with this money? What would you buy with this money?" Now, for me, a kid in the 90s, my favorite thing was rollerblading. I don't care what you think about it. Rollerblading was rad. It was fun. It was probably one of the things I did the most. I would watch this movie called Airborne about rollerblading, and then as soon as it would over, I would grab my Walkman, put on my rollerblades, and just bomb hills for hours. So I wanted a new pair of rollerblades. Really wanted this specific pair. They were K2. That was a rollerblading brand for those of you that are wondering what I'm talking about. K2 rollerblades. But then he said something that completely crushed me. He told us that all of this money was going to the church. I was shocked. I was bummed. I was all the negative feelings. For one, because I really wanted those rollerblades so bad. I mean, I was just a kid, okay? Don't judge me. But then it wasn't just about that, because I looked around our house, um, and I saw what to me looked like we were struggling. We had these old TVs, old microwaves, old appliances, old cars. For my entire life, I don't think we ever had a car that ran longer than 2 years. It felt like we were barely getting by on all of this. And I couldn't understand why we were giving so much to the church when to me it looked like we really needed it ourselves. And after that, I overheard something that really broke my heart even more. So, my father was a music major in college, music education, and also just music performance. He was an amazing musician, singer, all of that. So, when my dad went to college, the major, because you had to pick an instrument to major with, he chose bassoon. And my grandparents had commissioned someone to make a bassoon. It was handmade so that when he went off to college, he had this great instrument. So now, at this time, my dad had decided to sell his bassoon to come up with that extra 20% money in tithing, a part of that $5,000. And for me, it broke my heart because for one, it was handmade. He was an incredible musician. His parents had gifted to him that when he went to college. To me, it represented his passion, his talent, and he gave that up for the contribution. It just broke my heart. We weren't the only ones making sacrifices like this. Families all around us were doing the same thing. People were selling cars, jewelry, taking out mortgages on their home, dipping into retirement savings just to meet the church's demands. The pressure was enormous, and it didn't matter how much or how little you had, everyone was expected to give. And I rarely could wrap my head around it. Did God really need that money so badly that we all had to sacrifice things we loved and struggled to afford? It didn't make sense then, and it doesn't make sense now. It hurts. It really does to think about how much we gave while we were barely making it ourselves. And then when I went to college, the pressure didn't ease. In a way, it intensified. As a struggling student, I can remember being asked to sign a document pledging how much I would give each week. It felt invasive and kind of humiliating. They would track our giving through spreadsheets like we were employees meeting quotas instead of people navigating life. And knowing that my contributions were monitored created a constant sense of anxiety. There was no room to fall short without being noticed, questioned, or even judged. And if we didn't make our contribution that week, there was a sense that our salvation was in jeopardy. We weren't taking it serious enough. And the emotional toll, that was immense. The shame, the guilt of not meeting expectations. It felt like I was letting God down, disappointing the church and failing my community all at once. Sometimes I laugh about that to think of how much I believed, you know, that I really thought that God was looking down on me. And when I couldn't make contribution, even though it was like $2, that God was just shaking his head at me. Like, how dare you, you know? Financial strain just deepened those feelings. I would watch my family struggle under the weight of these demands. Now it makes me angry and confused. How could a church, a place meant to provide hope, support, demand so much from people who had so little to give? And I've been questioning it more and more, the integrity of the system. Why is church asking families like mine to give more than they can afford, while its leaders often seem to live comfortably or even excessively? How can religious organizations justify such a blatant disregard for the struggles of its members? And then there's the manipulation. The church framed their demands as if God himself needed our money, as if his blessings were tied to how much we gave. It wasn't about giving from the heart or out of gratitude. It was about meeting quotas to prove your loyalty and faithfulness. The spreadsheets, the pledges, the constant appeals for more. It felt less like faith and more like control. And I see it in churches nowadays. I see it all over the place. And looking back, I see it for what it was: fear based giving. The emphasis wasn't on helping the poor, supporting the needy, or spreading love. It was about sustaining the institution. The system thrived on guilt, fear, and obligation, leaving so many families emotionally and financially drained. And these experiences have left me distrustful, deeply distrustful, of any organization that uses faith as a tool for manipulation. I believe in generosity and giving. I really do. But it's not when it's demanded, monitored, or weaponized. Faith should never be transactional. And I know I'm talking about something in the past, but at all of these churches, the manipulation might not be so overt, but it's there. It is there. And at the end of the day, I don't believe that God's blessings are for sale. I believe faith is about a relationship, not a financial transaction. And I think it's okay to question these practices, to ask whether they align with what Jesus really taught. Maybe that's where true faith begins, by seeking answers and staying true to your convictions. And so I ask you, should churches with significant wealth and sprawling property be taxed differently than small community based congregations? Is it fair for churches to enjoy tax exemptions while public schools and infrastructures critical to communities are struggling for funding? And are churches truly serving the public good when their financial practices remain opaque? Think about that. And as I bring this episode to a close, I can't help but reflect on the complex relationship between faith, finances, and accountability. Visiting churches, examining their practices, and looking back on my own experiences have shown me how vital it is to ask hard questions. Questions about fairness, questions about transparency, and questions about what it truly means to serve the greater good. And I get it. It's hard, but these are questions that we need to ask. Need to ask our pastors, need to ask our leaders, need to ask the churches. And at its best, faith should inspire love, generosity, and a sense of community. But when financial practices lack transparency or feel manipulative, it is fair to ask whether these institutions are staying true to those values. Should churches with significant resources be held to the same standards as other nonprofits or businesses? Are they using their tax exemptions to genuinely serve the public, or does this privilege shield them for accountability? And I know I'm not the only one seeing this or speaking about it. There are multiple voices raising awareness and calling for change. Accounts like Preachers, Sneakers, Prophets, and Watches highlight the extravagance of some church leaders, while others are using platforms to question whether these practices align with its core values of faith. These conversations aren't about tearing down the church, but holding it to a standard it claims to uphold. And I want to point out one thing. I forgot to mention this earlier in this, but I just can't not talk about this because, we're talking about the manipulation and the pressure to give, about how the money is used as well, right? So there's this church here in the city that has a trolley car system for their parking lot, and their parking lot is no bigger than a super Walmart's. So I get that churches want to provide convenience and comfort for their members. But when I see things like this, I start to wonder, is this what people are giving their money for? Is this what God intended when he asked for faithfulness and generosity? To me, it raises real questions about priorities. If a church can afford a trolley system for a parking lot, are they truly focused on the needs of their community? Or is some of this more about creating an image or a brand? It's things like this that make me question how much the giving in some churches is it really about serving God versus serving the institution? And I know I jumped around. Thank you guys for letting me put this back in, but I just couldn't forget about talking about this. But these conversations aren't about, I don't want it to seem like I'm trying to tear down the church. I'm just trying to talk about upholding it to the standard it claims to uphold. For me, this conversation is more about money, or more than money. It's about aligning faith with values like justice, honesty, and care for those who need. What kind of world do we want to build together? How can we ensure that our spiritual communities contribute to that vision? I'd love to hear your thoughts. What have been your experiences with faith and giving? Do you feel your church or any church is living up to its calling? Share with me your stories, questions, perspective with me on social media, Clemens with a Z, or at email at clemenswithaz@gmail.com. Let's keep this dialogue alive because those questions, to me, are questions that matter, not just for me, for all of us. So thank you guys for listening. Thanks for your support of the podcast. As always, you can please like, rate, subscribe, review, share, all of that. It's the easiest way that you can support the podcast and this conversation. If you'd like to support the podcast financially, you can go to the GoFundMe link that'll be in the show notes, or you can find it in the bio at the Clemenz with a Z Instagram page. So until next time, guys, peace.